Fate, as it is presented now, is a continuing story that stands to show the resilience of humanity. Be it in the form of heroes fighting for their ideals, or striving to become a hero of justice, or even fighting in the restoration of all of humanity. Something that seems to be missing from many of these larger-than-life legends is the very same root of what Fate narrates. That is, being human. Legends such as Gilgamesh and his journey to best the gods, Siegfried's tale of slaying the near-immortal dragon Fafnir bringing peace to his country, or a more modern example in Tesla with his unparalleled genius that helped to bring the power of the gods to our household, is something that really detaches them from humanity itself. These legends all seem to be completely out of the reach of the common man, but their stories do serve to inspire others. So, when a character who is exceptionally human is introduced, it is something truly special. Hello everyone, and welcome to Behind the Servants. Today we discuss the legend that is Don Quixote. Don Quixote was the main character of the novel of the same name by Miguel de Cervantes, written in 1605. Today, Cervantes is known as the greatest author of the Spanish language, and the man who revolutionized the novel. Originally a soldier for the Navy, he lost the ability to use his left arm after becoming a casualty of a naval battle. He would also be captured and eventually released. This time being in prison would become the subject of many of his early works. While these works were moderately successful, upon the release of the first half of his novel Don Quixote, he received elevated levels of fame. The second part was not as well received, as it was much less comical and viewed as a more philosophical piece, but was still highly successful nonetheless. For reference on the absolute levels of success on this story today, it is the 6th most translated book of all time and has been translated into every major language. Number 1 is, of course, the Bible. Number 2 is, surprisingly, The Little Prince, which is what inspired Voyager's design in Fate. However, some people wish to enjoy it in its native language, such as Sigmund Freud, who, supposedly, learned Spanish for the express purpose of reading the novel. But what exactly about this story has enraptured the globe so much? Well, that's a loaded question. If you ask anybody why a book is good, you're going to get every answer possible. So, in my opinion, to put it simply, it is because it is a story of the human spirit. But I'll be getting into that a bit later. For now, allow me to summarize the adventures of Don Quixote. The story begins by introducing Alonso Quixote, a low-ranking Spanish noble known as a hidalgo, who lives with his niece near La Mancha. Described as nearing his 50s and normally a rational man, recently he has been keeping himself up at night reading the tales of chivalrous knights and adventures to the point that he's become convinced that every single word on the page is true. For a historical reference, the time in which this story is set is at the very end of the Age of Knights. Convinced of everything, he dresses himself in an old suit of armor, gives his old horse the name Rocinante, and renames himself Don Quixote. He declares a neighboring farmer girl to be his princess, dubbing her Dulciana del Toboso, without her knowledge, of course. He then rides to an inn, believing it to be a castle, and demands that the innkeeper dub him as a proper knight. He talks with the prostitutes there and addresses them as proper ladies. To get him out of the inn itself, the innkeeper sends him to the stables, where he begins keeping himself awake for a vigil for his armor set. This is interrupted by a group of men who are trying to water their mules, also in the stables, and attempt to remove the cumbersome armor outside. This causes a scuffle that is interrupted by the innkeeper, who, reluctantly, dubs the insane old man a knight and sends him on his way. Next, we have two different tales of roadside encounters. The first is he comes across a servant being beaten by his master over a wage issue. Don threatens the master and demands that he treat the worker fairly. The man agrees, but as soon as Don leaves, beats the servant twice as hard. He then comes across some merchants who he believes are insulting Dulciana. Thus, he attacks them. As he is not a real knight and has no real combat training, he is beaten and shipped home by a peasant. While he is knocked out, his niece, housekeeper, and a priest burn all of his chivalric books in hopes of preventing his delusions from continuing. Now, the importance of the priest is that he was brought in to decide which books were to be spared and which ones may be disruptive to public morals. Funny enough, the priest is able to recite lines from every single scandalous book, almost as though he has thoroughly read through each and every one of them. They steal the room, and when Don wakes up, they tell him that a magician has blocked it by some magic, which he accepts because, you know, playing into a crazy old person's delusions is probably the best way to go. As his health is not fully recovered, he believes he needs a squire to continue his adventure. He enlists the help of his neighbor Sancho Panza, with the promise of a governorship and an island should he agree. Sancho is a poor but down-to-earth farmer who agrees to the position. Together they set off at the wee hours of the morning. They first encounter a pair of giants in what is likely the most famous part of the entire story. Don makes a head-forward charge at them and smashes unsuccessfully into the stony exterior, being repelled. Sancho attempts to tell him that those are in fact not giants, but windmills. Don ignores this and attempts again, with similar results. He then concludes that the giants have become windmills, and as such cannot defeat them now, so he moves on. Next he encounters a pair of friars traveling with a lady, which Don perceives as evil monks who have kidnapped a princess, so he attacks them as well. He challenges one to a duel, and as he has no shield, uses a pillow. Realizing that they are dealing with a completely insane person, the princess calls them off and asks them to surrender. This is one of the few times Don actually wins. In fact, I think it's the only time he actually wins. After this, they begin traveling with some goat herders who they get on well with. They are invited to the funeral of a student who read the stories of a shepherdess named Marcella, which brought him to his death as he chased after her. She appears at the funeral and laments at her being the subject of the stories and vanishes into the woods. Don and Sancho follow after her but lose her, and instead take a rest by a river. While here, a herd of ponies appear and Rocinante attempts to mate with one of them. When the herders hit him away, Don and Sancho take up arms but are both thoroughly beaten. They then come upon an inn to stay the night, which again, Don believes to be a castle, but Sancho not so much. They're given a hayloft and a rug to sleep on. While he tries to fall asleep, he imagines a servant girl that he solved to be the castle's princess, and imagines a full conversation about her agreeing to come to bed with him. She does appear to take care of some of the guests, and Don grabs her and tries to snuggle with her. Her boss sees this and attacks Don, and a full-out brawl ensues. Again, having Don and Sancho beaten senseless. The next morning, Don decides to leave without paying, and Sancho is wrapped in a blanket and thrown about as punishment. Once he is free, the pair continue. They come across a galley of prisoners and criminals who are going to be made into slaves, and Don, cutting out everything except the slave part, frees them, which naturally, they leave and go wreak havoc upon the town. He then also finds a bucket that he believes is the helmet of a famous knight and begins to wear it. Next, they encounter a man in the mountains that has gone completely mad as well. However, Don seems to ignore this. The man is in love and wanted to become engaged and shares his poetry about his love with a friend of his named Fernando, who then also falls in love. So, this man's story goes a little bit like this. He had fallen in love and had wanted to become engaged, and so he shared his poetry about his love with a friend of his named Fernando, who then falls in love with the girl in the poems. Upon hearing this, Don quotes that the man's love has been unfaithful, and the group fights, leading to Don and Sancho being beaten again. Don begins to miss his imaginary princess and gives Sancho a letter to give to her. Sancho instead finds the barber and priest from their hometown and devises a plan to trick Don into coming home. Funny enough, they found a woman in the forest named Dorotea, who had been tricked by Fernando with talks of love and marriage and left in the mountains. She appears before Don claiming to be the princess in need, and he takes the bait so easily that his comrades cannot help but to laugh. The group returns to the inn and Don begins to sleepwalk/box in the wine cellar, believing that he is fighting the giant that stole Dorotea's kingdom. Then Fernando and the love of the crazy man in the mountains appears at the inn. Now all four of the star-crossed lovers are gathered and return to each other. You can actually chalk this up to another victory of Don's, as he actually managed to somehow, miraculously, get two relationships resolved. But all good things must come to an end, and would you believe it, there is a warrant out for Don's arrest, mostly for freeing the prisoners. The priest convinces the officer seeking Don to go easy on him because he is quite literally a crazy person, and so the officer agrees. They put Don into a cage and convince him that it has been foretold that he will return home as a true hero. On the way home, they think that Don has behaved himself well enough and let him out of his cage, and he immediately picks a fight with more shepherds and pilgrims, all of whom kick the hell out of him. He is then transported home unconscious. Now, this is where the original manuscript ends. It is important to note that Cervantes presented much of this as though it were discovered, and when he continues the story later, it is being presented as though people are aware of the first part already. This includes people in the story. This is evidenced by the opening involving a duke and a duchess who encounter Sancho and Don. Sancho has convinced Don that 3 peasant girls are in fact Dulciana, made to look like peasants. To break this quote-unquote curse, the Duke and Duchess, who are just massive trolls, convince Don that Sancho has to give himself 3,300 lashes, which Sancho refuses, driving a rift between him and Don. Now, under the Duke, Sancho is given the governorship of an island, which he was originally promised. However, it is merely a setup, but Sancho proves to be a pretty solid ruler, but ends up leaving after a week of pranks by the Duke. Slowly, Don is beginning to return to reality. The nail in the coffin is a planned final fight between the Knight of the White Moon, who is actually a boy from Don's hometown. They duel on the beach of Barcelona and Don loses. As per the terms of chivalry, Don agrees to submit to the winner, who commands him to lay down the arms of chivalric duty for 1 year. He returns home and originally plans to become a shepherd, but is convinced to stay home by his housekeeper and niece. After this, he becomes deathly ill, and then awakens from a dream, curing him of his insanity. He apologizes for his actions, and says that he will disinherit his niece if she marries a man who reads chivalric stories, and then dies. Thus ends the tale of Don Quixote. So, why has this tale endured for so long? Well, for one, it's the comedy. I'm not really doing it justice by just describing the events in it. You should go and read it for yourself, because the way how the comedy is actually laid out is done perfectly. The type of comedy presented, though, is one that has been enjoyed by every civilization that has ever existed. Schadenfreude. It is the spectacle of watching somebody get hurt and taking pleasure in their misery and feeling justified in the action because they are either a bad or crazy person, with Don falling into the latter group. Despite what we humans may believe about ourselves and how vastly intelligent and how wide our scope of reality is, when our ape brain sees somebody skateboard into a wall or trip and fall, there is a reaction that the brain provides that often leads to laughter. This isn't to say that we don't feel bad for the victim, but the circumstances just elicit laughter from us. Don Quixote in the story is a terrible person. He attacks people recklessly, is easily offended by nothing, leaves inns without paying, drops his whole life for adventure, frees prisoners, the list goes on. So, seeing such a person get his comeuppance time after time after time is comical. But what makes it better is that despite all of this, he always continues on. Plus, Sancho providing the role of a straight man just to control his insane leader makes them a comedy duo. But what does this have to do with the grand introduction I provided for such a wild, rampaging knight wannabe? As I said up top, everybody who reads a story will have a different moral or message that they took away from it. So, I'm busting out my literary knowledge to give you mine. My personal read of Don Quixote is that he exists as a perfect example of childhood innocence, while Sancho is the looming reality of growing old. What young boy or girl has never imagined the romantic idea of becoming a knight? To travel and fight for the honor of your royals, saving others in need, and journeying with delightful comrades was one of my own personal childhood dreams. Of course, the real life of a knight is one involving martial arts, a lifetime of training, practice in weaponry and horseback riding, incredibly strict codes of chivalry, and fighting for one's lord. A proper knight doesn't just pick fights with those on the streets. If you want to walk out of an establishment without paying cash, you better have paid for it with honor or blood. Don exists as the childish envisioning of knighthood, the one that we all wish we could live and see the world as, while Sancho continually attempts to remind him that it is all just that, a childish envisioning. Funnily enough, Sancho himself seems to become enraptured by this fantasy by the second part. The awakening from the dream in the final part is the breaking of the fantasy in a very easy to understand way. It's Don quite literally waking up from the childish delusions and returning to reality, but then he dies shortly after. Why was it considered necessary for him to die at the end of the story? Well, the right and historical answer is because it's to prevent the story from going forward any longer, so Cervantes doesn't have to write about this crackpot anymore. But the answer that I enjoy more is that Don had finally gotten to live out his dream. He had finished what he wanted out of life, to become a knight who upheld the rules of chivalry. Even though he was horrible at it, he still lived out his dream and ended it in a way befitting of a knight. That is, fighting another knight on the moonlit beach with everything on the line. He was actually able to fulfill a proper knightly deed, that being in losing a duel of honor, and then having to accept the rules of chivalry themselves. He actually gets to be the knight that he always wanted to be. To put it rather bluntly, he did what he wanted and then he died once he finished. The ending would suggest that he regrets his actions, but I don't truly know if I believe this. To me, it reads more of a realization that others should not follow in his precise footsteps, but he himself holds no regrets for his actions. He was able to live out his dream and could now die with no regrets. Because think about it quite honestly, how many times are you realistically going to get your ass beaten by everybody that you meet and still pursue the same dream? It's nothing if not remarkable. On that, I believe that Fate's portrayal of Don Quixote is possibly one of the best examples of writing a character to be as close to the original as possible. His kit implies that he can switch from his delusions and reality at will, and with his delusions he's more powerful, but when he's in reality, he is smarter. I would also argue that Rocinante's portrayal fits well because she is, in reality, all of the characters of the story rolled into one, with her main image being that of the delusional Don's ever-elusive love, Dulciana. His portrayal as a squat man whose armor reduces as he becomes more powerful is honestly an amazing bit of storytelling built into design. But what is most striking about him in Fate is that he still appears incredibly human. He gives in to his delusions, is surrounded by famous heroes and knights, and still persists to show off that he can keep up despite merely being a cosplayer. Plus, I was spoiled on some Lost Belt 6.5 stuff involving him that I won't share here that really paints him well as a very human character. Just know that if you go into a non-spoiler area and start spreading that kind of info, I will cut the soles off all of your shoes. Don Quixote is an example of humanity in its purest form. Almost silly in its simplicity, but he captures something that is incredibly valuable for humanity, and that is our persistence and our resilience. Even if it is something as trivial as chasing a dream, it's beautifully human nonetheless. Ride on, little man. Ride on. But that is it. Don Quixote's book in the books. Thank you all so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. Let me know what you thought down in the comments. Also down there, let me know who you want to see next. Clearly, I have a soft spot for this guy, and I think that's totally fine. Like this video as it really does help out the channel. Subscribe to catch these as they go up. Hey, join the Discord and follow my Twitch for significantly less structured content. But for now, keep your chin up. Peace.